So, have you ever had a moment with God that was so real, so powerful, so just unmistakably Him that something in you whispered, I don't ever want this to end? Like those moments where you just knew it was God speaking to you and doing something in your life, and you thought, I would love to live here forever. Maybe it was at a church camp when you were younger. Man, you had a great experience at church camp, and you remember what that week of camp was like. God was working in your life. Maybe it was at a conference. Maybe it was on a retreat. Maybe it was in your car, and you had worship music going, and it felt like the lyrics were just for you, and it drowned out every other thing in your life, every problem, and it was like the voice of God was just cutting through all the clutter in your life and speaking directly to you. And maybe you thought, if I could just stay in this moment, if life could just feel like this every day, that would be enough for me. That's what I want. I believe God gives us those moments. They're gifts. They're a taste of His glory. They're like little previews of heaven, right? But I want to say something today that is going to sound wrong at first. So I'm asking you to stay with me and lean in. Don't write me off. I think it'll make sense to you towards the end. But here's what I want to say. The danger of faith is when we start believing that the goal of faith is to live in mountaintop moments forever. I'll say it one more time. The danger of faith is when we start believing that the goal of faith is to live in mountaintop moments forever. Now, doesn't that sound wrong at first? Because you might be thinking, like, Nathan, all I want is more of God. Like, all I want is to be in those moments with Him. Over and over again, I want those. And I'd give anything to have more of those moments. My time, my struggles, my money, anything. To just live in that moment forever. But here's the tension. Everyone must leave the mountain. Everyone. If we're going to follow Jesus, we cannot build our lives or our church around staying comfortable in spiritual highs. We must be willing to walk into valleys because that's where people are. We've been in this series called Great Faith, and we've talked about people in the Bible who had great faith moments. And what I want to present to you today is that perhaps the greatest faith we can have is when we leave the mountaintops. Matthew 17 is one of the clearest pictures in the entire Bible of this reality. The chapter starts with glory on a mountain. We just read about it, and we'll read it again here in a minute. But it ends with a need in a valley. And what we find out is that Jesus is Lord, the same Lord in both places. So today I'm going to give you 4 points that I think we need to learn and to understand how God works to mature our faith in Him. And here's my prayer. My prayer is not that you leave with goosebumps. My prayer is not that you leave with more emotions or a moment. My prayer is that you leave with roots, with maturity. So let's read Matthew 17, 1 through 5 again, and I'm going to point a couple things out as we read, and then I'll talk about it for just a moment. So verse 1, and after 6 days, Jesus took with Him Peter and James and John his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves. So it's just them. And He was transfigured before them, and His face shone like the sun, and His clothes became white as light. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah, talking with Him. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 tents here, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah. He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to Him. When the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Rise and have no fear. And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. And then I want to read just the first few words from verse 9. And as they were coming down the mountain. So what we see here is that the disciples, number one, they have a revelation on the mountain. They have a revelation on the mountain. Matthew, the author of this book, begins with a detail that we can't skip over in verse 1. He says, and after 6 days. Now that's not filler. Matthew is a very purposeful and careful writer. Every word matters. In Exodus chapter 24, Moses goes up to the mountain. The glory cloud covers the mountain much like it did here. And after 6 days, God calls Moses out of the cloud. So in Exodus 24, you have 6 days, you have a cloud, you have a mountain, you have a voice. Matthew is drawing a line for us. He's saying God is revealing himself again. But this time, the revelation isn't merely a law. This revelation is a person. So Jesus, having taken Peter, James, and John up on a high mountain by themselves, very intimate, it's a very focused time, it's very intentional. And then Matthew says that Jesus was transfigured before them. And that means that he had a visible change that revealed his inner reality. And what we need to know is that Jesus does not become divine here. He reveals the divine glory he already has. So his face shines like the sun, his clothes become white as light. And here's what I want you to feel. These disciples on this mountaintop with him, they've seen him teach, they've seen him heal, they've seen him calm storms, they've seen him multiply food, but now they're seeing behind the veil. They're seeing the carpenter from Nazareth as the Lord of glory. And in the middle of that, Moses and Elijah appear, talking with Jesus. And this is not random. Moses represents the law, the foundation of Israel's story. Elijah represents the prophets. They were the voice that would call Israel back when they were wandering and sinning. So you had law and you had prophets. You have promise and you have anticipation. And both of them show up pointing to Jesus. This tells us that Jesus is not a side note in God's story. He's the center of God's story. It's been about him all along. Everything Moses wrote, everything the prophets longed for, find its fulfillment in Jesus. And then the Father speaks while they're up there on that mountain. He says, "This is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." And I want you to see what God's doing here. He's showing them Jesus' identity. He says, that's my son. That's his identity. He is my son. And then he's revealing his affection towards him. He's saying, that's my son whom I love. And then it's like he's stamping his approval on everything, saying, with him I am well pleased. But then he gives them instruction. He says, now listen to him. That last one matters because the disciples are about to hear a lot of things. They're about to hear a lot of noise. They're going to hear fear in their own minds, doubt. They're going to have crowds pressing on them. They're going to experience spiritual oppression. They're going to have their own insecurities. So the Father says, drown it all out and listen to him. And I want you to hear this, please. God gives mountain moments as revelation for us, but not as relocation. I mean, he gives us these incredible experiences that you've probably had in your life as moments where he makes himself real, but it's not a relocation, it's not a destination. A mountain moment is God strengthening your faith before you face the valley. It's God reminding you who Jesus is so you can trust him when life gets hard. And because Moses and Elijah are standing there with Jesus, let's slow down for a minute and ask, why them? Like, why not Abraham? Why not David? Why Moses and Elijah? I think it's because both of them had defining mountain moments with God, and neither of them were called to live on the mountaintops. Let's start with Moses. Moses probably had more mountain encounters than anyone else in Scripture. In Exodus 3, he meets God at Mount Oreb in the burning bush. You've probably heard that story. His life is changed in one conversation. In Exodus 19, he goes up Mount Sinai, and God descends in fire, smoke, and thunder, and the mountain shakes. In Exodus 24, Moses goes up into the cloud of glory for 40 days and 40 nights, and he receives the covenant, the commandments, the pattern of worship for us. In Exodus 33 and 34, Moses on a mountain pleads to God. He says, "Show me your glory," and God lets him see it. And when Moses comes down, his face shines so brightly, the people are afraid to look at him. Now imagine for a moment, if Moses had decided on those mountaintops, this is it, just me and God. No people, no problems, no complaining. But Moses couldn't stay. That wasn't his mission. There were people at the bottom of the mountain. There was a nation to lead. There was a calling to fulfill. And the first time Moses came down from Mount Sinai, you remember what he found? He found them worshiping a golden calf. A major mess, the people sinning, going off track, drifting. You know what Moses does? He doesn't run back up to the mountain to hide, saying, I'm done with them. He intercedes, he confronts, he leads, he obeys, he fulfills his mission. Mount Sinai is where Moses saw God, but the camp, the valley, is where Moses served God. You see, the mountain was the encounter, but the camp was obedience. Now, what about Elijah? Elijah had mountain moments too. 1 Kings 18, he had an experience on Mount Carmel. You've probably heard of this. He had a showdown with the prophet of Baal. A fire falls from heaven. God proves he is the one true God. This is a mountaintop moment if there ever was one. But then right after Mount Carmel, Elijah crashes. He gets threatened, he's afraid, he's exhausted. He runs to God and he tells him, I've had enough, just take my life. Like, I'm done with all this, I'm done with people, just take my life. So God leads Elijah to another mountain, Mount Oreb. And on that mountain, God feeds him, strengthens him, and speaks to him. But not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in a gentle whisper. And I think this is the part we miss about that story. God didn't bring Elijah to the mountain to escape people. God brought Elijah to the mountain to restore him for people. Because what does God do next in Elijah's life? He sends him back down the mountain. He gives him assignments to go anoint kings, to raise up the next generation leader named Elisha, to stay faithful, to finish his race, to fulfill his mission amongst the people. You see, Elijah's mountain moment wasn't the mission. It was the refill for his mission. So when Moses and Elijah are standing on that mountain in the book of Matthew with Jesus, it's like God is preaching to the disciples before Jesus even speaks. The mountain is real. The glory is real. This is a great experience. It's a mountaintop moment. Enjoy it. But this isn't the mission. The mission is down there. And that sets up point 2 for us, because they had a revelation on the mountain, but then we notice that they had reluctance to leave the mountain. Peter says, Lord, it is good for us to be here. And he's not wrong. Like, that's a great thing to say. This is a holy moment. This is beautiful. This is the kind of moment you're never going to forget. If Peter had just said, Lord, it is good for us to be here, and stopped talking right there, that would have been great. But like Peter often does, he keeps talking. Because then he says, if you wish, I will put up 3 shelters. Peter is doing what we do. He's trying to freeze the moment, to preserve the experience, to control the glory and contain it and live in that moment. He's basically saying, let's build something so we don't have to leave. Let's make this permanent. And if we're honest, we can understand that mindset, because valleys are hard. Mountaintop moments are incredible. Valleys are messy. Valleys don't feel like worship nights. Valleys don't feel like what church camp used to feel like. Valleys feel like real life. They're hard. They're difficult. But here's the danger. When we believe the goal of faith is to live in mountaintop moments forever, we start chasing experiences instead of chasing Jesus. We start measuring our faith by our feelings. We start thinking God is more present when we feel goosebumps. And slowly, without realizing it, our faith becomes self-centered. We begin to think things like, how did that service make me feel? Did that worship set hit me directly? Did that message speak to me exactly how I wanted to be spoken to? Listen to me, Jesus is not building a faith that can only survive under worship lights and conference stages. Jesus is building a faith that can walk into hospitals, into funerals, into broken marriages, into prodigal children, into anxiety, depression, loss, and disappointment. He's building a faith that can walk into those things and still say, I know who my God is. I've had the mountaintop experiences. They're incredible, but most of life is in the valley. You see, if my faith only works when the atmosphere is perfect, it's not Jesus I'm clinging to. It's my emotions. So Peter's not evil. Peter's human. But Jesus is trying to shape him because Jesus didn't call the disciples to stay. He called them to follow, to go. And Matthew proves it with one sentence in those few words in verse 9. He says, as they were coming down the mountain. They came down the mountain because the mission was there. So after they had a revelation on the mountain, and then they had reluctance to leave the mountain, there came a point where they had to return to the mission. The people are down there. And I want you to notice the movement of Jesus. He's always moving towards people. He's always moving towards need. He's always moving towards brokenness. It's the heart of God. Because valleys are not just a place of pain. Valleys are also where your faith becomes real. Valleys are where your theology and what you learn on the mountaintop is brought down into the valley and becomes your testimony amongst the people. Valleys are where God takes what you saw on the mountain and works it into how you live on a Monday, on a Tuesday, and on a Wednesday. I remember the first job opportunity I had out of college. I was so excited. I've been in ministry my whole life, and I just wanted to be in ministry. So I went to college, got a job in West Virginia, where I was going to be the youth pastor, associate pastor, and a whole long list of things. And I was thankful the way God was providing for my family, and we moved up there. It was just my wife and I and our youngest son. He was a little baby, or my oldest son, he was a baby at the time. And we move up there and start settling in, and shortly after arriving there, I get the call that my dad had a heart attack in Texas, and I'm in West Virginia. And then within that next week, he dies. I mean, I just had this mountaintop moment where it felt like God was doing everything for me, and I was relying on him, and it was incredible. And then I felt so low, and I remember asking God, how can I be so grateful yet so broken at the same time? Have you ever been there? Where you're celebrating one thing and grieving another thing. Where life feels like it's mixing joy and sorrow all at the same time. You see, on that mountain, I saw God's provision. He was providing for my wife and my son and my family and giving me exactly what I had wanted. On that mountain, I saw God's provision. But in that valley, I wrestled with God's sovereignty. I did. If I'm honest, I would have loved to just stay on the mountain. I would have loved to stay in the season where it was all up and to the right. But my faith was not going to mature on the mountain alone. It was going to be tested, deepened, and strengthened in the valley. Some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. You had a God moment, and it was everything you ever wanted, and you'll remember that for the rest of your life. But then you had a gut punch, and everything changes. You had a breakthrough, like something you had been praying for maybe for years, and God answered that prayer, and you were so thankful for that breakthrough, but then you got a diagnosis that you weren't expecting. Maybe you had a new opportunity, and God's providing for you, and he's giving you what you've wanted, and he's blessing you, and you had a new opportunity, and then you walk through a loss. And you're asking in those moments, did I do something wrong? Did God leave me? Did I mishear him on that mountaintop? But what we need to know is that the presence of a valley does not mean the absence of God. And the timing of the valley does not cancel out the reality of that mountaintop experience. Sometimes God gives you mountaintop moments so you will have a foundation when you enter the valley. Because God is not teasing you on the mountain and then abandoning you in the valley. What he's doing is showing you his heart on those mountaintop experiences so you can trust his heart in the valleys. Jesus is returning to the mission. They're coming down the mountain. Not because the mountain was real. It was very real. It was incredible. But he's coming down the mountain because the valley is where people are. So they had a revelation on the mountain. They understandably had reluctance to leave the mountain. But ultimately, they had to return to the mission. But once you return to the mission, you're going to have reliance in the valley. You won't make it without dependency and reliance on him. I want to pick up reading in verse 14 of Matthew 17. And I want you to feel the pain of this story and what happens here. In verse 14 it says, "And when they came to the crowd, a man came up to him and kneeling before him said, 'Lord, have mercy on my son, for he has seizures and he suffers terribly. For often he falls into the fire and often into the water. And I brought him to your disciples, and they could not heal him.' And Jesus answered, 'O faithless and twisted generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him here to me.' And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the boy was healed instantly. Then the disciples came to Jesus privately and said, 'Why could we not cast it out?' He said to them, 'Because of your little faith,' period. 'For truly, I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here to there, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you.'" Verse 14 says, when they came to the crowd, the moment they reached the bottom and they reached that valley, there's a crowd, there's noise, there's need, there's loss, there's disappointment. And so this man, this father, approaches Jesus and kneels at his feet and says, "Lord, have mercy on my son." That line is full of pain. This is a father who has watched his child suffer. This is a parent who feels helpless. And if you're a parent in here and you've ever had your kids go through something difficult or be diagnosed or have a sickness, and you know what that's like. You want to help, you want to take it from them if you could, but you feel so helpless, you feel hopeless. There's nothing you can do. And then he says something that should sober us. He says, "I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him." So not only is he desperate, but he's also disappointed. He tried the disciples. He tried the very people who represent Jesus, and it didn't work. And I want you to not miss this. Jesus does not respond by retreating back up to the mountain. He doesn't say, "This is messy. Let's go back to where it was good and joyful and where we had goosebumps and where everything was glorious." He doesn't do that. He steps in. He speaks. He confronts the problem. He heals the boy instantly. That is the heart of Jesus. He doesn't just reveal glory on mountains, although he does do that. He also shows mercy in valleys. Then the disciples come to Jesus privately and they ask the question we probably would ask. Why could we not do it? Like, we've done it in the past, Jesus. Why can't we do it now? And Jesus answers, "Because you have so little faith." He says, "But if you have faith as small as a mustard seed." And you see, mustard seed faith isn't big faith in your ability. It's real faith in a big God. It's not about the size of your confidence and just trusting and confidently that you can do this. Rather, it's about the object of your confidence. Jesus is not telling them to hype themselves up and have a pep talk and just believe more. He's telling them to depend on God. And in other gospels, in the same story, he points them towards the discipline of dependence of prayer, of fasting. And he tells them the point isn't a magic formula. The point is reliance. Reliance in the valley, dependence, desperation for God. You know what I have found to be the hardest part about being a Christian? If someone was to ask me, Nathan, what's the hardest part of Christian? Here would be my answer. Daily dependence. Daily dependence. Because I love the mountaintop moments, but most of my life is lived in the valley. Most of my life is pretty routine. It's pretty regular. It's waking up. It's getting the kids to school. It's picking them up. It's going to their games. It's being a husband. It's being a dad. It's being a worker. Most of my life is lived in the valley. And it's there that I must daily depend on him, in his strength, in his power, in his plan for my life. For me, waking up every day depending on him is the hardest part of being a Christian, because I like spiritual highs. I like goosebumps. I love the highs of church camp feelings and powerful sermons and worship nights. But that's not reality. Those are great, and we experience them, but that's not most of life. Most days, I just need dependence to be a good dad, to be a faithful husband, to be a good employee. And that's not flashy. That doesn't give me goosebumps, but that's reality. You see, the disciples were trying to do kingdom work without kingdom dependence. And as a pastor whose full-time job is ministry, I can find myself doing kingdom work without kingdom dependence. But I don't think that applies to just pastors. As parents, what higher calling do we have than to raise our children right? Is that not kingdom work? How dare we try that on our own power without waking up daily depending on strength from God to lead our family well? As a husband, do I not have the duty to daily love and lead and guide my wife and my family? That's kingdom work. I can't do it without kingdom dependence. As a disciple, as a follower of Jesus, I have a duty to tell others about Christ and to be a light at my kids' games, at the store, at my job, and you do too. As teachers, as bosses, as government workers, as coaches, as employees, as ministry leaders, as store clerks, as mechanics, everything you are doing in the normal routine valley of life is kingdom work. So you're going to have to be kingdom dependent each and every day. So Jesus teaches them, if you want mountain moving faith, you need reliance-centered faith, not self-confidence. Not performance, not confidence in yourself or your ability, confidence and dependency on God, which brings us full circle. I believe great faith is not staying on the mountain. Great faith is following Jesus down into the valley, confident that the same God who revealed himself on that mountain peak will meet you in your pain, will help you as you come alongside others in their pain. And so I want to give you just 3 thoughts to take away today, and I would encourage you to write these down or to take a picture of the screen, but these helped me, and I think it'll help you as well. Number 1, receive mountain moments as gifts, not rights. Man, you're going to have some mountaintop experiences, and they're incredible, but they're gifts from God. It's not everyday life. They're going to be pretty uncommon, and appreciate them as gifts, not rights. Not something you deserved. Thank God for them, but don't demand them. Number 2, don't be surprised by valleys. Most of life is lived there. Sometimes valleys are not punishment, they're assignment. They're assignments to be a disciple of Christ, to show others Jesus. And number 3, look for people in the valley. There's always hurt people waiting at the bottom. You can't go very far with walking past someone who's hurting. You can't come into a room like this without many people going through difficult things that are hurting. So look for people at the bottom. And so I want to speak to 2 groups as we close. First, if you're in a valley right now, and life just feels difficult or maybe even just routine, and you're tired of doing the same thing over and over again. You look into this week and you know what this week is going to bring because it pretty much is the same thing that the last several months have brought. Routine, waking up, doing things over and over again. And maybe you feel the ache and the disappointment in that. Maybe you're in a dark valley and life is hurt and you just got news that you wish you didn't have to hear. Maybe you're hurting and you feel confused. Please hear me. Jesus comes down from mountaintops and he steps into valleys. He's with you. Bring it to him. He shows mercy in valleys. Secondly, if you've been chasing mountain moments but avoiding valleys, I want to invite you to surrender that. Stop making experiences the goal. Daily trust God in the valley where most of life is lived. Read his word. Pray daily. Don't be a hermit living alone trying to avoid everyone's problems. Jump into community. Get involved in people's messes with them. One thing we learned today is that community isn't optional. It's a mission we have to come down off the mountain peaks where it's very few people into the valley in community where people are. Yes, it would feel nice to live on a mountain sometimes, wouldn't it? And just avoid people and their problems, kind of like Peter wanted to. But the mission can't be fulfilled if we avoid people. Our mission is people. So following Jesus means we go where he goes, and he goes towards people who are hurting, and so should we. So would you close your eyes and bow your heads for a moment? Man, I know I am super thankful for mountaintop experiences. I can look back at my life at a few times where I felt like God was talking directly to me, and it was just me and God, and I loved those moments. But they're pretty few and far between. Most of life is pretty mundane. It's pretty routine. Most of life is lived in the valley. And I bet I'm talking to a bunch of people here today who are just living in the valley of life. Yeah, you've had some mountaintop experiences, and maybe everything about you has been pursuing to get that experience back, to have that feeling again. But what if God is just trying to show you his heart in the valley? Don't miss that. And if you're here today and you are struggling and you don't know what your next step should be, I'm going to pray that God would make that clear to you. That you would know that he is a God who doesn't just live on mountaintops. He lives in the darkest valleys with us. So I'm going to pray for us and then invite you to stand and worship with us. So let's pray. Father, I do thank you for the mountaintop experiences. God, I can look back and just know they were some of the most incredible times of my life. But God, you don't expect me to live there. You've called me to a mission. You've called this church to a mission, to live in the valley with people who are hurting, who are struggling, who don't know how to take their next step. And so God, may today we feel a calling to return to our mission, to know that we carry your name into the valley and we point people towards you. And so God, help us to not chase experiences. Help us to chase you. And it's in your son's name we pray. Amen.